is to ask somebody with contemporary political experience to kind of review the subject of political leadership and the issues that need to be thought about in carrying it through. And my view certainly was that Peter was extremely well positioned to do that. He's known about particularly Labour Party, but also general national political leadership for a very long time. His mother was Herbert Morrison's daughter, and so his grandfather, Herbert Morrison, a very, very big player in Labour politics, as you all know, over the period from the 1920s through to the 1950s, and involved in many controversies about political leadership in the Labour Party of that time, which I think went over your dinner table in the evenings as you discussed many of the issues. But he was also living in Hampstead Garden suburb as I was, and that's when I first met him. Very knew Harold Wilson extremely well. He lived just round the corner, and the Labour Party where Peter grew up, Harold Wilson was engaged in the discussions, and of course Wilson was the first post-war breakthrough, the first post-Attlee breakthrough, with his concepts of political leadership, which were very controversial and very difficult, but again, Peter was absolutely familiar with the arguments and discussions around those questions. We then came together again after Neil Kinnock became leader of the Labour Party. Peter and I worked very closely with Neil as leader as we went through the process of trying to make Labour again electoral in a whole series of ways. Peter made a whole series of very innovative approaches to how Labour should operate, from its policy proposals to its communication strategy to some of its basic organisational questions which in my opinion Labour needs to be thinking about right now too. And he was then elected to Parliament in 1992 and worked closely with Tony Blair once he was elected leader of the Labour Party. And I think it's fair to say that Peter was one of the very, very, very small number of people working very closely with Tony on winning power again. He discussed with Tony at length the various leadership challenges that Labour was trying to deal with at that time. And so again, I think is particularly well suited to help us today. After a period in government in a series of different offices, he then went to be a committee. And they exist. I didn't mention those. I think there's an interesting aspect of political. There was a discussion earlier about followers, about the impact of leaders on followers, and I think Peter, perhaps both of us could talk a little bit about that with some interest. But he then went to the European Commission, and the discussion we were having just earlier in the last session about the quality of European political leadership and of national political leaders for other European countries, he saw very close hand. And then Gordon Brown asked him to come back to the UK as Deputy Prime Minister in the last period of Gordon Brown's government. So again, was very intimately engaged with Gordon as he was trying to put his leadership on track leading up to the 2010 election. I think you'll agree Peter has a tremendous range of experience, and we look forward very much, Peter, to how you see political leadership both historically and in the current year.
When Charles asked me some time ago to speak about the challenge of political leadership, I accepted with alacrity. I have worked for a few leaders. I am very political, and I'm always up for a challenge. I have to say that when I started looking at these books there last weekend, I nearly sort of shrunk away. They all look so daunting. They're so sort of measured and well done and everything. I wasn't absolutely sure I could rise to the occasion, but nonetheless I am here and very grateful to Charles for inviting me. Indeed, it has to be said that if it were not for Charles Clarke, I wouldn't be standing here today, because he was instrumental in giving me my first opportunity to work for a political leader and to get up and personal and close when I became Neil Kinnock's campaign director in 1985. So thank you, Charles, very much indeed for setting me off on this long journey and trajectory. I don't think everyone will be absolutely grateful to you for launching me on the Labour Party, as I am. However, I just have to say, because it's just thrilling, I went before I came in here, just a small digression, to the Archive Centre here, absolutely brilliant. And Andrew, if he's here, got some things out from the archives, including a wonderful memorandum sent by a Conservative, within Conservative Central Office, to the chairman of the Conservative Party, reporting to him on the new appointments made by Neil Kinnock at Walworth Road in September 1985. They were so efficient, these Tories. I tell you, it's a 3-page memorandum on who was appointed. And it says of me, a little bit, it says, in the end it says, I like this particularly, it says, former colleagues of Mr. Mandelson say he's very able and therefore an unwelcome choice for our He will, however, have to prove he is tough enough to push through changes in the face of any left-wing opposition from within the NEC. I mean, these people were absolutely spot on. And then it goes on, and it finishes by saying, it says something about the guy who was appointed a policy director. It says, ends by saying, it may not be too cynical to suggest that with a strong director of campaigns and communications, the role of policy development will, in time, become subordinate to the campaigning function. I mean, how prescient is that? I'm not proud of that, obviously. I mean, they absolutely had it spot on, these people. Now, I'm going to talk about a little bit of history and bring you up to date with Jeremy Corbyn. But you'll just have to live with the Labour bias in me. My knowledge starts of Labour leaders. Starts with Attlee, skips over Gatescourt, who I never met. He was from another part of Hampstead. And then stretches from Wilson to Callaghan to Foote to Kinnock to Smith to Blair and then to Brown. I should say that Ed Miliband also went out of his way to befriend me when I returned to the cabinet from Brussels in 2008. I have to say, during this time, it never honestly occurred to me that he aimed to substitute for his brother. I thought he just liked my company. It never occurred to me that he might have leadership ambitions at that time. How wrong can people be? Now, let me get, in a sense, straight into it. The earliest Labour leader I met was Clement Attlee. I was 11 or 12 years old, and Marcia Williams introduced us 10 Downing Street in 1965. I was there at the invitation of our garden suburb neighbour, Harold Wilson. Clem, she said, very loudly to the former Prime Minister, this is Peter. He's Herbert's grandson. And at the mention of my grandfather's name, Attlee sort of slightly flinched, I noticed, barely looked up, and then finally grunted, quite articulate by Attlee's standards. But I say this in order to draw a lesson from Attlee's interaction with my grandfather, Herbert Morrison, his deputy. And that is that leaders and second-in-commands don't actually have to like each other in order to work together. And that in fact, the more they are complementary rather than identical, the greater is their reach into the party and to the electorate. And if you look at the top teams, this formula actually seems to work pretty well. Wilson and George Brown, on a good day, Wilson and Roy Jenkins, ditto on a good day. But then look at Callaghan and Foote, who just kept the entire ship, afloat from 1976 to 79. Foote and Healy, Kinnock and Hattersley. Don't necessarily have to love your deputy and vice versa in order to be a dream team. Blair and Prescott. And on the Tory side, Thatcher and Whitelaw, Major and Heseltine, Cameron and Osborne. Point I'm making that each has brought something to the leader in party management, or in some cases political argument, and occasionally governing competence as well. So the leadership matters, is the point I'm making, not just the leader, although inevitably it is the actual leader inevitably who matters most. And you just have to look at the difference it would have made to events and to history if the runner-up had won rather than the person who got elected, and if the roles had been reversed. I don't think that none of Morrison to Attlee, George Brown to Harold Wilson, Michael Foote to Jim Callaghan, Roy Hattersley to Neil Kinnock, or Prescott or Whitelaw would have been anything like the leaders they were deputy to, or would have been able to deliver what the leaders did, or to even, in many cases, even be elected in the first place. So leaders really matter. You just have to look at those who are runners-up to make the point. And this, I think, unique responsibility of the leader is summed up well by the book's authors, if I can paraphrase them. The ability, the responsibility, the ability to get the party in the right place to win, and then govern competently in order to get re-elected. That is how I would sum up the responsibility of a political leader. And I put winning elections without apology at the apex of the leader's role, because you would not expect me to do otherwise. But remember, we are dealing with political parties here. We're not dealing with debating societies. We're not dealing with flower arranging clubs. We're dealing with political parties, the central point of which, but I'm going to come back to this at the end of my remarks, is to play the absolutely sort of seminal role in our entire political system, which is to recruit people from the public in order to hold office and govern everyone else. And it's political parties that do that, which is why they are so important and why their leaders are so pivotal. But here is the question. Has the Labour Party been less successful than the Conservative Party at winning elections because too often it has chosen or stuck with the wrong leader? And the answer must be yes. But it works the other way too, that the party itself has a nasty recurring habit of destroying its own electoral chances, whoever it is or however good the leader might be. And that's the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. The Labour Party has a better unerring knack of putting itself between its voters and holding office than the Conservatives, who in the main through history have been a more cohesive and professional political party than the Labour Party, which has too often preferred ideological dispute or sort of fratricide. So a successful leader, through persuasion, through self-belief and force of personality, tries to move his or her party in a winning direction. That's the job of the leader. If the leader doesn't get this, or is too indecisive or uncourageous in doing so, it's time for another leader. But time and time again, through our party's history, they have chosen to stick with somebody who was either indecisive or uncourageous or otherwise not so good at the job. And the leader is the principal originator of the party's winning strategy. The leader does not wait for the strategy to come to him. He's a proper leader. A good leader then recruits the best people available to flesh out the strategy. A deficient team produces a deficient, or even more deficient leader. Now, the most successful, once-in-a-generation Labour leaders were clearly, in my view, and I think the book supports this, were Attlee, Wilson and Blair. Each of these three was both a progressive and a moderniser. Attlee, a rigid, uninspiring, yet unifying and dependable figure, with enormous help from my grandfather, from Hugh Dalton and Ernie Bevan, successfully guided Labour's recovery from its electoral debacle of the 1930s, through the moulding of its policy programme during the war years, and then to victory in 1945. The narrative, coming from people who had proved their patriotism during the war, very important, that narrative that took the Labour Party to victory in 1945 was really strong and really clear. We must rebuild and modernise Britain and leave behind the poverty and the inequalities of the pre-war era. And everything in that Labour Party campaign revolved around that core proposition. Attlee was by no means the sole author of this narrative, but more than any other, he embodied it as the leader of a party of conscience and reform. Wilson, grammar school educated, very significantly, pipe smoking, reassuring, with a very fertile policy mind, did exactly the same after 1963, with more flair and more broadly-based appeal than Gates School before him. Recovery from the splits and defeats of the 1950s, the shaping of a post-Grouse-Smalls modernising programme for Britain's economy and its society, and then on to victory just in 1964. Again, Blair with knobs on after 1994, with his polish and his charm, strong visionary speeches, always telling a story about the country and eager to shape the future. He delivered recovery from the devastating 1980s, from which Kinnock had originally rescued us, the complete renewal of the party's policy programme, starting with Clause 4, and then with more ingenuity and consummate political skill than Smith or Kinnock before him, led us to that victory in 1997. In the case of the Conservatives, exactly the same winning formula, in my view. Recovery, renewal, strong message were deployed by Macmillan, post-Suez in 1959, Heath and Selsdon Man in 1970, Thatcher, obviously, in 1979, and Cameron in 2010, following the dark years of Hague, IDS, and Howard. Each successful leader, each of those I've mentioned, won the battle of ideas in the election argument, achieving assertion, if not hegemony, of their political argument. They looked the part. They owned their narrative. They made good appointments. They got their parties and then the public to trust them. In each approach, Labour and Conservative, there was a completeness of leader and party. First, insight about the state of the country and what the public were looking for. Empathy, absolutely essential. Second, policies that were genuinely distinctive and relevant and credible. Third, using passion and discipline to drive home the message and to win confidence in both the leader and the party's offer, the two things being inseparable. Now, in each case, it was not only the leader's personal qualities that brought success, although these were, in my view, of paramount importance. What permitted success was the party not getting in the way as Labour's divisions and ideological preoccupations had done for Gaitskell in 1959, Callaghan in 1979, Foote in 1983, my God, and Kinnock in 1987. By 1992, I think Kinnock could have won, but frankly, the party's recovery from the 1980s had simply not gone far enough or deep enough for that to happen. So party and contextual matters, contextual factors, really do make a difference. They really do matter. Not least because they can knock leaders off their stride. They can knock them off their balance. They can make leaders so much more tired and weary and distracted than if you have a sort of clear sort of line of vision up the field to the electoral winning post towards which to head. Interestingly, look at the end of those Labour governments as well. Attlee and the rest. When the vision went stale, as Attlee's and Labour's did, frankly, by 1950, 51, in which Harold's did by 1970, and Blair's, or more precisely Brown's, in 2010. When the vision went stale, when the programme ran out and the message evaporated, there was defeat in each case. Now, I feel my framework works both in the winning and the losing. Perhaps it's a question of governing stamina. 1 minute you have it, and the next you don't. And how you deal with events is obviously central to this. Ironically, I think the global financial and banking crisis rescued Gordon Brown's administration and his leadership. For 6 months, he seemed to be the right man in the right place. How wonderfully events conspired to lift him up from a terrible mire in which he had fallen since he became Prime Minister in 2007. Thank God for the banking crisis. But then events. A combination of his past, Damien McBride's emails, plus his temperament, volatile, and his lack of empathy as a leader. The public were much more worried about the deficit than he was, and he didn't get it. Those things, that combination, then defeated him. Now, perhaps that is the fate of former chancellors who become tail-end Charlies, as Roy Jenkins had originally predicted to me would be the case with Gordon. If so, George Osborne better watch out. Although, as usual, the Labour Party is helping in its own way. Now, the higher you get up the food chain towards becoming leader, your calmness and your cunning are tested. Sometimes you can be too cunning for your own good. Was this true of Harold Wilson? When he resigned in 1976, I remember exactly where I was, and I remember exactly what I thought. The brilliant magician who kept Labour together, is gone, and now the Labour Party is going to fall apart. That was the very first thing I thought of when I heard the news mid-morning that Wilson had resigned. Now, on reflection, perhaps the magician became the victim of his own magic, with too many compromises and too many trade-offs for the sake of internal party management, or the magician's luck and his stamina ran out. But either way, I think people will feel vexed in their judgment of Harold Wilson for a very long time to come. I think he's a very, very interesting subject of a leadership study, because he is so complex, and because you can make so many arguments about him in so many different ways. For all his conscience and his cunning, and both were real, some feel he used his office less well than he could have done, and that his influence and the imprint that he left were weaker as a result. Which brings me, if I may, to some sort of finishing thoughts. A lot of people say, and it's easy, I must say, to agree with them when you think of sort of giants like Attlee, or Wilson, or Blair, or Callaghan. A lot of people say that we don't have big politicians anymore, and that our political leaders are not like they used to be. Has that thought ever occurred to you in recent times? I'm afraid that our politicians probably do come now from too narrow a cohort. They are inexperienced in politics, quite apart from any other walk of life. Many of them look and sound like, well, basically what they are, which is former special advisors to real grown-up politicians. They're too identikit. They've spent far too much time inside the Beltway in SW1. Not enough time running businesses or working in the professions or travelling or understanding the real world, or indeed from the shop floor. I mean, people who've had to earn a living rather than being brought up, as I say, as research assistants or political advisors. I'm not sure what to suggest we do about this, but I think it's extremely serious. There is a shortfall in the quality of political leadership available to the public to vote for in our country now. And I think it is a real issue in the context of our functioning democracy and our government. The problem, actually, lies in the political parties. The political parties themselves have become more like sects rather than genuine mass parties, unrepresentative of the population as a whole, inward-looking, always looking for a sort of reaffirmation from those around them of views that they've already arrived at and don't want to think more about. I'm afraid that is, I'm not talking, by the way, not just about the Labour Party, I'm talking about all the political parties. And Labour's recent attempt to widen its base, I think, has hardly succeeded, except amongst in broadening the Labour Party and opening it up to people, except amongst, basically, with respect, tertiary educated, middle class, and in the main people, who come from the public sector. Those in the main are people who have come into the Labour Party this year, apart from all the ex-Green Party trots, some of the Trotskyists and whatever. Apart from them, the mass of people who have come into the Labour Party are people who sort of are already exactly like the Labour Party. Sort of middle-aged, sort of white, sort of middle-class professional, sort of tertiary educated, and sort of working in the public sector. That is not, by definition, representative of the British population. And therefore I fear this may exacerbate our problems rather than provide a cure for them. Now, for a long time, Labour leaders have been criticised by some in the party for being too keen on winning. Kinnock, throughout his leadership, was accused of electionitis. I mean, he pleaded guilty, by the way. Gaitskell was complimented for not treating Labour like a vote-maximising machine. You know, he was happy to lose votes rather than to maximise. Blair is damned. Heaven knows Blair is damned now for having won 3 elections in a row, apparently a crime for some in today's Labour Party. Now, I agree that what you do in office is more important than how you win it. But the one, I just say to you, has to precede the other for it to be put to the test. And I don't believe that there is any use for Labour without it honestly believing that it can be elected as a progressive party committed to modernising the country, efficiently managing a mixed economy, and always pushing against inequalities in society. That is the job of the Labour Party. How it does so, obviously, will vary from generation to generation, just as something fresh and electable now has to grow out of New Labour. You're not going to win the next election in 2020, by fighting on New Labour's manifesto and battle cries of 1997. It has to be fresh, it has to be new, it has to sort of, the Vatican has to sort of keep sort of renewing its thinking. And you don't have to, reject your past, you don't have to renounce your past, you just have to sort of fold your past into something which is new and revitalised. But I don't think, and I agree with Charles's observation that he was making as I came in, I don't believe that producing something new, fresh and electable out of New Labour will come from Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And I think it's an important sort of subject to evaluate, really, because it goes to the heart, in my view, of the quality and the purpose of political leadership. I say this not just because he's too far outside the political mainstream for public tastes, but actually more fundamentally than that, because he has only an ambivalent interest in making Labour a party of government. He's more at home in extra parliamentary action and the people and organisations which drive extra parliamentary action and protest. Yet something strange did happen when Jeremy Corbyn won the leadership, because he chimed with something in the public's mood, or that part of the public who were paying their £3, precisely because he is so far outside the mainstream in a sense. He chimed with the public's mood because he's out of the mould. He doesn't look or sound like yet another sort of buttoned up, tight-lipped politician sent by central casting down there at Milbank, where that awful old Mandelson machine used to reside. And this is very important for the public, because he seems to be like somebody who was more himself, less sort of manufactured, less interested in how he needs to fabricate himself, and therefore more authentic. Now, the public likes authenticity, and their mood does not stop there. The public actually want leaders who altogether are less imprisoned by their party orthodoxy. They want individuals who are capable of thinking for themselves, who are neither sent by central casting, nor taking their orders and their scripts and their photo opportunities and their taglines from the central direction department of the movie, at Millbank or wherever it is. But the public are also pessimistic, and they find it difficult now, broadly speaking, to believe anything they're told by politicians. This cynicism, I think, puts an even greater premium on credibility. And here's the point I really want to make about Jeremy Corbyn, just to take him as an exemplar of a wider point I want to make. And that is that the authenticity that Jeremy Corbyn undoubtedly represents to the new supporters and fellow travellers that gave him victory in a party election is not, in my view, the same authenticity that the public will be looking for in a national election. For the public, the authenticity of leadership they want is one that allies conviction with credibility, resonating with people's lives as they are, not in the imaginary utopian universe of a far-left leader of the Labour Party, and one which sets a credible path to progress in the future, because people aren't stupid, they're practically minded people, they're pragmatic people, and they want to be offered something which they know is capable of happening, of being implemented. And successful political parties and their leaders understand this. Parties, by the way, in my opinion, are not redundant. I mean, I am harsh in my criticism of the state of political parties in this country, but they are still absolutely essential in defining our country's broad political values. But parties now have to work so much harder to regain trust, which they forfeited, in particular by, but not only as a result of the financial and banking crisis. And they also need to lose their antipathy, political parties, to the world the majority of voters inhabit. Many people in parties, left and right, want to be pure. They want to think of themselves as pure political people who have a sense of belief, of ideological purity. I'm talking about Labour people or Conservative people. In other words, people who don't think like ordinary members of the public at all, which is not how people think in the real world. And too many in the centre-right and centre-left think that the centre ground means abandoning values and diluting belief, and therefore they're resistant to it. Now, it doesn't necessarily result in abandoning values and diluting belief. It means being more public-facing, less distant from the electorate, better able to communicate. It's what governing parties do, as opposed to protest movements. For genuine leaders of effective office-seeking parties, there is now so much for them to compute the whole time, and so much more for them to come to terms with in order to create that relationship and sustain it with the public. There are so many more ways they have to communicate and are communicated with. And it's why being a political leader is harder now than it has ever been before. So what is my final thought about this? The fact that leapt off the page to me in reading the book on Labour brings me back to the question I raised at the beginning of my remarks. And it is that of Labour's 17 leaders down the century, only 6 have been elected. Whereas of the Tories' 19 leaders during the century, 16 have been elected. Now, as a Labour man, this shocks me. It shocks me, and we need to really think why. I think the explanation is that Labour much more than the Conservatives, is a party that has always contained two cultures. One that wants to be elected, and the other that feels more comfortable with opposition. It affects who is selected as leader and whether they can then get elected by the public. And I think it's at the heart of the Labour Party's current dilemma. But the difference between now and the past for Labour is that whereas those who are more comfortable with opposition, those who prefer protest over government, have been on the fringes of the Labour Party, now, for the first time in our history, they have actually taken the leadership of the party. And that's where I think there is a question mark over the purpose of the Labour Party now, and why people are asking what the Labour Party is for under Jeremy Corbyn. And nothing like this has ever happened to the Conservative Party. They've never actually been taken over by people who aren't fundamentally interested in pursuing and winning office. Now this has happened to the Labour Party for the first time. People who are more comfortable with opposition and protesting than taking the responsibility of office and government. And that's a terribly profound and fundamentally important insight about the current state of the Labour Party. I hope, for all our sakes, this does not spell permanent one-party rule in Britain, but I do think it makes you think. Thank you very much.